Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 247 of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. The title of today's interview is IGeneX, an interview with Stuti Vora. My name is Matt Sabatello.
My name is Richard Johannesson.
So most of us have heard about IGeneX testing before, but we don't realize how powerful and how advanced their testing can be in helping us overcome obstacles when healing Lyme disease and co-infections. Stuti talks to us about all kinds of testing methodologies that have helped patients overcome emotional and physical barriers while healing from Lyme disease. She also gives you specific details on how to work through the requisition form to identify what tests are right for you, either in partnership with a doctor or the customer support team. So without further ado, Stuti Vora and IGeneX.
Hey, Stuti Vora from IGeneX Labs, and welcome to the Tick Bootcamp podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
And we're really excited to have you too. It's been a long time coming. We've been trying to get somebody from IGeneX onto this podcast because we've heard over and over again that your lab is the best lab for tick testing and Lyme disease. And it's really time for the three of us to get together and talk about why the community feels that way. Before we go there, I'd like you to first introduce yourself personally to our community. Talk to us about who you are and what your title is over at IGeneX and what's your background.
Sure. Well, first of all, you make us sound like a leopard, really elusive, but we're not. Just kidding. So I've been here for around 8 years, and I started off in the customer service department, and it was customer service and billing. So I got to know a lot of different functions, and I'm now a customer service supervisor, and I work with the marketing group and the sales group. So we're a smallish lab, so everybody wears a lot of hats. And our main function is to make sure our customers are happy, that we can at least service the Lyme community in a way that will bring them some peace or, great testing, anything to make them feel heard, feel better, and, improve their lives overall.
So Stuti, talk to us about IGeneX and specifically about Dr. Harris, the founder of IGeneX.
Yes, of course. So IGeneX was founded around 30 years ago, just over 30. I think we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And it was Dr. Nick Harris, who started the company. So IGeneX originally was part of VMware, and they used to do allergy testing. And then in 1991, he transformed it into testing for tick-borne diseases, specifically Lyme disease at the beginning. And then they brought on Dr. Shah, and Dr. Shah introduced more diseases for IGeneX to test for that are carried by ticks as well. And since then, it's just been evolving into what we are today.
So talk to us about Dr. Shah, because Matt and I at some point would really be excited to introduce ourselves and our community to Dr. Shah. But since we don't have the opportunity to do that just yet, can you talk to us about Dr. Shah, because she is considered one of the stars in the community?
Yeah, of course. So her passion is science and research, and especially genetics. And so one thing, she comes from Kenya, so do I. And she was brought over from the East Coast. She used to be a researcher at Harvard, and she came over to IGeneX and has been just started off as in the laboratory, became the lab director, and is now the owner of IGeneX and still the lab director as well. And she's constantly looking at improving our testing, seeing how we can do better, how our testing can look for more, detect more, just help doctors diagnose their patients correctly.
Now, Stuti, I shared with you offline that, and I guess we started to talk about it during the introduction, that we've interviewed about 250 people who have chronic Lyme disease, and almost to the person, your lab is considered the standard for Lyme disease testing. Almost everyone has said to us that if they had to choose a lab to be tested for, again, they would choose IGeneX. So talk to us about why the community has come to the conclusion that the state-of-the-art testing comes from your lab at IGeneX.
Wow, first of all, we're very grateful for that feedback, and it's It's amazing. It's amazing to hear. I believe it's because we're not just following outdated CDC guidelines. So the CDC hasn't actually improved on their guidelines since 1994 for testing, and a lot of mainstream labs use those guidelines and two-tier testing. Whereas where we develop our tests in-house, we have a really strong R&D department, and basically again, what Dr. Shaw is bringing to the company is constantly evolving our technologies, making sure. So one of the examples is how we went from the Western blot, where we were already using 2 antigens, to develop our Western blot versus mainstream labs who use 1. We're using both Borrelia burgdorferi B31 and 297. And from that, we now have our immunoblots, which are unrivaled. It's like doing 7 or 8 Western blots in one test. And you're looking at a variety of species of Borrelia that cause Lyme disease, or Tick-Borne relapsing fever, or Bartonella, because we offer immunoblots for all those 3 diseases. And it's more sensitive, more specific. They're very clean blots because you're using recombinant proteins. And so there's not a lot of background noise, and they're easy to read.
So I'd like to talk to you about the different testing tools you have available to the community. And I did also share with you offline that a couple of years ago, I was bitten by a tick. I went to my doctor's office and I did not have a positive experience. And I don't want to belabor that, but one of the things that happened during the course of my interaction with my doctor's office is that I gave them a tick, and I said to the doctor's office, hey, is this tick that I found biting me something that you can test? Is this something that, that will be significant in you treating me? And the tick was handed back to me, and I was told that they didn't need to do anything with that tick. So does IGeneX offer any testing for ticks if folks are lucky enough to hold on to the tick that they found biting them?
So if you are fortunate enough to have the tick, a lot of people get bitten and never knew they were bitten and don't feel it. But if you're able to save that tick, that's one of the best ways to get started. And it's also one of the most affordable ways, because you can get the tick tested. We offer tick testing for Lyme, Bartonella, Babesia, Ehrlichiana plasma, rickettsia, and also Tick-Borne relapsing fever. So all the diseases that we test for Tick-Borne diseases. And each test is around $75. But it's so worth it because it's a PCR. And so you're looking at the DNA of the bacteria or parasite and the whole tick. And you're getting a very good answer as to whether the tick was carrying the disease or not. And so that helps you also figure out what your next steps are. And you don't need a doctor to order a tick test. You only need it to order a test on a human sample. And so if you do find a tick, it's worth sending in. It's also important to know not to just test it for Lyme disease. We do hold the ticks for 2 months. So if payment options are a problem, then you can always, add on a test later. You don't have to order everything at once. And so your story is really familiar. Not just I guess in a way, testing the tick part, a lot of doctors do say yes. So I'm surprised you had such a negative experience there, unfortunately. But it's even worse when people want to get themselves tested. They're made to feel like they're going crazy. And that just, there's already a lot of mental health problems and mental illness associated with tick-borne diseases. And then this just adds an emotional aspect to it and makes you feel worse instead of getting the support that's needed.
So let me tell you how my experience went downhill from there. The tick that had bitten me, which I did not know at the time, I didn't know anything about ticks or tick species, but the tick that had bitten me was a Lone Star tick. And I now know that Lone Star ticks do not harbor Lyme disease. But one of the things that I was offered was a Lyme disease test. So I was told after I went back 6 weeks later that I could then take a Lyme disease test, and they gave me a Lyme disease test. And then I was called a couple of weeks later and told I didn't have Lyme. Now, of course, now I'm looking back at it like, holy cow, this is just crazy and ridiculous and incompetent. But at the time, I thought I was being treated, appropriately, at least from a testing standpoint. So if I wanted to help my doctors in the future with how to appropriately test me after I went and sent my tick to IGeneX to have the tick tested, what are the 3 options of testing that are available to folks in the community from IGeneX? I understand that you have a blood test, a urine test, and then a miscellaneous test.
So those are the type of sample that you can test. It's not exactly, we can have PCR tests available for all 3, for example. So really most of our tests require blood. It just depends on the doctor and where they think the bacteria or parasite might be and what sample type they want to test. A lot of doctors like to do an antibiotic challenge and follow up with a urine test, but initially start with a blood test. So most people will do blood testing initially. And we have several different types of tests for several different types of tests. So the tests include both indirect and direct tests. Direct tests are looking at the bacteria or parasite in the blood itself, whereas indirect tests are looking at your antibodies. So immunoblots, for example, or Western blots are indirect tests because they want to see how your body is reacting to infection, whereas PCRs, and everyone's getting really familiar with PCRs right now because of COVID, are direct tests because they're looking at the DNA of the bacteria in your bloodstream. So, and seeing just, whether it's there or not. One isn't necessarily better than the other. It's usually recommended to do a combination, so you're covering a wide spectrum.
All right, so they're just different tools to give you information about what may be going on and give you a higher degree of accuracy of locating the pathogens that you may be harboring.
Exactly.
So now your blood testing, how many different pathogens do you test for at IGeneX with a blood collection kit?
So every disease that we test for, we offer a blood test. So that would be, we consider Lyme and tick-borne relapsing fever together as borreliosis. It's really prudent when you're testing for Lyme to consider tick-borne relapsing fever. The symptoms are almost the same. And so you don't know what you have, especially because symptoms in general for tick-borne diseases are non-specific. So we test for Lyme, tick-borne relapsing fever, Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, and plasma, and rickettsia. And rickettsia covers Rocky Mountain spotted fever.
So now, Stuti, if I were bitten by a tick and I wanted to have an IGeneX blood test and I went to my doctor, would I be able to purchase the kit from IGeneX directly and then bring it to my doctor's office? Or would my doctor's office have to purchase it directly from IGeneX?
So you can go about it either way. If you have found a doctor and they want you to do most of the legwork, because that is very common in this community and it happens, you can definitely pay a deposit for the kit and we'll send you one. It's a $20 deposit. Once you receive it and your doctor signed off on the paperwork, helped you choose test, and you've had your sample drawn and sent back to us, we'll credit you that $20 against the price of the testing. The other thing is the doctor can also order the kit and have you come in. There's no fee for the doctor. The only reason we have a deposit is to avoid wastage of kits. Yeah.
So now let's talk about the urine collection kit. We were told, for example, by Dr. Casey Kelly that she likes urine tests, especially for children who are sometimes adverse to giving blood. Talk to us about the urine kit and when the urine kit appears to be used most often at IGeneX.
So our blood testing is definitely around 90% of our testing, but so there are some doctors who like to have urine testing done on their patients. And specifically, it's because they can do antibiotic challenges. We don't have any recommendations on those since we're the lab, we do leave it up to the doctor and what they want to administer. And so they believe that they can draw out the bacteria into the urine. And so by doing the antibiotic challenges, they want to see what will happen when they test the urine. It also is a very good testing method for children, especially babies, because you can squeeze the urine out of the diaper. And
so what pathogens do you test for in a urine test? And are there a fewer number of pathogens or a greater number of pathogens when you're testing with the urine kit by contrast with testing in the blood collection kit?
So we definitely do like less testing for urine. I would say Lyme disease is the most popular urine test. So we have our urine panel. We do tick-borne relapsing fever testing as well for urine. And recently we've started offering the co-infections as well. And that's in a panel. So we have a panel, it's the tick-borne disease panel number 7. And that's basically a full PCR urine panel.
Okay.
And
so
it's for all the diseases.
So I understand that you're testing both for Bartonella, Babesia, Rickettsia, Anaplasma, and Ehrlichia with your urine test.
Correct.
So let's talk about the last collection tool you have, and that is the miscellaneous collection kit. And when are folks using the miscellaneous collection kit?
So the miscellaneous kit is really when you want to test a sample that's not blood or urine. Basically tissue, cerebral spinal fluid, placenta, breast milk. So it's cord blood, you can use the blood kit, but there is a belief out there that the disease can transmit in vitro. And so patients do like to test the cord blood or the placenta just to see if it's passed on to the baby.
I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest not just a belief, but a lot of evidence to suggest that is the case. And we did a comprehensive interview with Dr. McDonald, who I think has certainly convinced most people in the community that the evidence is undeniable that Lyme is a congenital disease. But that's probably a conversation for another day. We'll move on.
Personally, I am a strong believer that yes, it is. But obviously, it's more controversial, as everything with Lyme is, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is the case. So now, the last area I'd like to explore with you before Matt gets to finally, very anxiously ask you some questions is I wanted to talk to you about the test requisition form. I downloaded that from your website, and what I was looking for was what test I would want to discuss with my doctor after getting bitten by the tick a couple of years ago. Quite frankly, I found the form to be overwhelming. And I realized that the form is a form for a doctor, not for a patient, and that you have a number of comprehensive tests. But how would I, one of the things that we've learned in the community is that we have to help our doctors. Our doctors, unfortunately, are not adequately trained, and they aren't necessarily going to be capable of providing us with the level of care that we need unless we help them, right? And we've done some stuff at Tick Boot Camp where we've created a Tick Bite Blueprint, and we've put a number of different resources in the Tick Bite Blueprint that we encourage people to bring with them to their doctor. One of the things that we're also going to encourage them to do in the future is to bring their IGeneX requisition form with them so that they can now also help their doctors to define what type of testing they should be doing. So Stuti, how would we, in a very broad way, look at the testing that's available and help our doctors with defining what kind of test we would want as a threshold level after being bitten by a tick? And Matt will talk to you about people who are suffering from chronic Lyme disease, but I'm the guy who's walking in after a tick bite. What panels do you think I'd want to look at myself so that I can discuss them with my doctor?
So admittedly, yes, this requisition form can be really overwhelming when you first look at it. And that is something we recognize, and we've been trying to make it simpler. And it's actually one of those things that's very difficult for us to do, because we're trying to please all the doctors as well with the different combinations that they want in panels to order for their patients. And so we want to be able to provide what's most beneficial for the community. And it just turns out that everybody wants something different. Go figure. It's like Baskin Robbins for the flavors. But I would say that when you first look at the requisition form, and as a patient, because honestly, patients are the main advocates. They advocate for themselves. It's hard to find that support unless you're looking at a Lyme literate doctor who believes in chronic Lyme. Then it's really, it's a struggle. It's an uphill battle. And so we have a really good customer service team. They're just sitting behind me, and they answer these questions all day long. And they're basically, someone will call in and say, I want to do the Lyme disease test. What do I do? And the first thing we'll ask them is it just Lyme disease, or are you looking at other tick-borne diseases? Honestly, if you only know of Lyme, it's worth considering the other ones. If you have no idea where to start, one of the things I like to tell patients is to do our symptom checker. So the symptom checker is on the website. It's under resources. It's pretty intuitive. It was developed by an LLMD in collaboration with our team over here. And it'll send you an email once you've done it, telling you which diseases to focus on. Just remember, if you see Lyme or tick-borne relapsing fever, consider the other one as well. And you can call back and let us know, hey, these diseases came up, and we'll tell you which tests are available that cover those diseases, or which panels are available. So panels are I really like our tick-borne disease panels because they combine everything, and it's just different intensity or complexity of testing depending on which tick-borne disease panel you choose. And then we've introduced some for New York residents as well, because the New York State Health Department is quite strict. And so it's hard to get approval for all the testing, and not everyone can go out of state. So we've introduced tests that are approved by the New York State Department of Health that combine all the diseases as well. This way, everyone is able to get good testing. Yeah.
Stuti, a couple of follow-up questions. You just gave us a ton of great information there, but I want to dissect it a little bit more. So we noticed on your website that you have almost 100 different tests available between individual tests and combination tests. But you also break it down based on region, what tests are available in certain states of America. And where we live in New York, it told us that we have 56 tests available and 42 are not. So what are those rules and regulations being enforced by the states that are not allowing certain tests that you offer to be available to us as patients in New York State or other states, for example?
Okay, so it's only New York. Everything is available everywhere except New York. And yeah, unfortunately. And so this, we've just launched that test directory that you're referring to, where you see those numbers. It's not as scary as that, because it's really just within the panel. It's like 1 or 2 tests, so they're not available. So for example, Babesia duncani, it's believed to be only a West Coast disease. So we haven't put it through for approval to the New York State Health Department because we know it's not going to get through. And even though there has been evidence to show that it's found everywhere in the US.
Like, we don't travel, right? I mean, New Yorkers don't leave the state ever either. So, I mean, come on, Recently, we had a patient call who said her doctor said the ticks die off when they get to a certain state. Wow.
I was like, that's really interesting. Wow.
If only, right?
Yeah, or they need a visa or a passport to travel. I don't know. It's crazy.
So that makes sense, though. So really, it's not as overwhelming or scary as it seems, because a lot of those tests that aren't available are just combinations of the same test over and over again. So there still is a wide variety of tests available for New Yorkers that are seeing those numbers on your website, is what you're telling us, Stuti, right?
Exactly. So you may not be able to the Bartonella Immunoblot, but I think that is something we eventually want to try and get approval for. But even though that's not available right now, there's still Bartonella Hensley and the Bartonella PCR that patients from New York State can do.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because I know there are so many commonly known tick-borne illnesses like babesia, like anaplasma, like Ehrlichia, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, et cetera. But there are some other less known co-infections or infections in general that we can get from ticks. So what things do you test for as well that are less talked about or less commonly known that are also as debilitating as Lyme disease and some other well-known co-infections?
So actually, Bartonella is one of those. And there is a lot of evidence for neurological symptoms. And we get a lot of calls in saying, hey, I think I've got Bartonella. What is that? And there's a debate, like people don't know if Bartonella is caused by ticks or if it's caused just by flies or, something your cat's carrying. Or so Bartonella is one of those. Rickettsia is pretty commonly, people call and they don't know anything about rickettsia. And then as soon as you say Rocky Mountain spotted fever, it's like, oh. So what else that we test for? I'd say Ehrlichia is pretty uncommon as well, and anaplasma. And those are all pet related as well. So it's worth, like, if you have pets, always be careful to check them as well as yourself if you've gone out anywhere, honestly, not just the woods.
When you say pet related, Stuti, though, like I know that people, it's out there that if you get scratched by your cat, you can get Bartonella, which is cat scratch fever, right? There are things like that. So when you say pet related, do you mean that pets will bring in ticks that will then infect the human, or do you mean that pets are able to actually give diseases to humans in the home? Like, what do you mean by that?
I don't know if pets are able to give diseases to the humans. Maybe they are, but they can be carrying the ticks. They can also get infected themselves. So I know dogs can get infected by Ehrlichia, and they need to get tested. There's labs that do testing exclusively for animals. It's So more on that aspect.
And I think, one of the things you point out on your website is 25% of people are infected with more than just Lyme disease, and there are other co-infections as well. And I think we're starting to see that number becomes higher as we get more sensitive and accurate testing like IGeneX. The more people test with better testing, we're realizing that, oh my goodness, that number could be as high as 50% or maybe even higher. We have one friend that we've made through our podcast who knew she had Lyme disease, and for years she kept testing negative for a lot of other things. She finally did a test through IGeneX through Dr. Casey Kelly out of Chicago, and now she knows she has Lyme. She has the European strain and she has the American strain. She has babesia, she has Bartonella, she has relapsing fever. So I think a lot of people think they just have Lyme, but there's a lot of other things brewing that they just don't know about, because testing is just as inaccurate for those co-infections as it is for Lyme disease through standard labs. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that number could possibly be higher than 25% even?
Yeah, I think so. I think also there's not a lot known about the spread of disease. And so by limiting your geographic region and saying, no, it doesn't exist here, you're also limiting what you could possibly be infected with. And I think for doctors, it's important, it's good for, especially the ones who are pro chronic Lyme and know how to treat people with tick-borne diseases. It's important to know what you're carrying, because it matters what disease you test for, you treat for first, and how it affects you subsequently. I've heard that if you've got babesia and Lyme, it's important to treat babesia first. Only then you can successfully treat the Lyme disease. So
yeah, we hear this all the time, Stuti, where people get a diagnosis with one tick-borne illness, they treat and they spend a ton of money. They see the world's leading Lyme doctor and they don't get better. Then they do better testing, or clinically they get diagnosed with a co-infection. They treat that as well, and all of a sudden it unlocks that door to healing, right? So I think it's an important factor when people are considering the financial impact of a test like IGeneX. Well, you could be going down the wrong road and spending a ton of money. I mean, we know people that have spent $60,000 to $80,000 in 3 to 6 months with a Lyme specialist, right? So money is a concern, but also you don't want to go down a road and be doing the wrong thing and spending, much more than a test to figure out what's going on in your body. But on that note, of finances as well. So Richard asked you about doctors and doctors trying to figure out this requisition form and identifying what tests to take and how it can be overwhelming. So many of us have Lyme litter doctors, but unfortunately they're out of pocket. So they're not covered by insurance. And again, finances are limited for many of us. So many of us find doctors who are covered by insurance, who are sort of either primary care doctors. In my case, I have a neurologist, who are traditional Western doctors, but are open-minded to tick-borne illness and chronic persistent infections. For those doctors who are interested and willing to learn that we've been able to find, like myself, are you able to speak to them? Does your customer support team speak with doctors to help guide them and educate them to help all of their patients in general? So if somebody's listening and saying, I have a really good doctor covered by insurance, they just don't know enough about tick-borne illness, can they call your customer support and get help?
Yes, they definitely can. And we actually, our lab manager is technically trained and is very, very knowledgeable. And if it's something that's beyond our customer service department, then she helps us. So she will transfer it to her, and she will then speak to the doctors, especially new doctors who don't know where to start or how to go about this and want to be there for their patients and be able to learn more.
So Stuti, I want to geek out a little bit with you. So for those that aren't pretty much everybody watching right now can't see us, obviously, but there's a giant sign behind you, an IGeneX banner, and it says immunoblots are a cut above, right? And I've been thinking about that the whole time since we started. So what is an immunoblot, right? I mean, look, we hear about all these things. We hear about PCR, we hear about ELISA, we hear about, IFA testing. We hear about all these different types of testing methodologies. And now we introduce an immunoblot. It's hard to keep up and understand what all these things mean, but clearly the immunoblot is probably one of the most cutting edge tests that we have available to the public. So talk to us a little bit more about what is an immunoblot, how is it different than a traditional Western blot, and why you're having so much success with it at IGeneX.
So our immunoblot is exclusively an IGeneX test, and it's basically as a replacement to the Western blots that we have out there. And it's what I was telling Richard earlier, it's like doing 7 or 8 Western blots in one test. You're covering a wide range of species. You're not just looking at American species. You're looking at species from Asia, Europe, around the world. Because honestly, tick-borne diseases are everywhere. Just because you're in Australia doesn't mean you don't have tick-borne diseases, as much as they'd like to say so. And same thing, Canada. And it's just a way to more accurately detect antibodies against these diseases. So it is an antibody test. It's an indirect test. And it's using recombinant proteins, which makes it highly specific and sensitive.
Okay, so when you say direct versus indirect, a direct test would be like a PCR test looking for the actual genetic makeup of the bacteria or virus itself. And then an indirect test is an antibody test looking for an immune response to the pathogen, correct?
Correct.
So the Western blot is an indirect test, and the immunoblot is a superior improvement based on basically a test I think that was created, in 1994, that we're still using today, mainstream. And now you have the immunoblot that is now superior and being used in your lab, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so, and then you mentioned it uses this recombinant protein to detect Lyme IgG and IgMs. What does that mean to use recombinant proteins? I don't really know what that means, to be honest. So
I'm not very well versed on that either, because it's more technical, but I know it just makes the blots cleaner, and it's you're more specifically targeting proteins that are significant to Lyme disease or to tick-borne relapsing fever or to Bartonella.
So as a follow-up, I do know that we studied you a lot, of course, in preparation for this interview, that your immunoblot is 93% sensitive compared to the traditional 2-tier testing, the ELISA and the Western blot, which is only 57.6% sensitive. So obviously there's a major improvement there because of this specific testing. But when we hear things like this, and we hear about all these different strains and it's more broad, right? One of the things that Rich and I always bounce around with our guests is we hear these terms all the time, like, species and strains and strands. So are you able to help us identify, because like one of the things you mentioned on your website is Borrelia burgdorferi sensu-lato. So what is that? Is that a strain? Is that a strand? Is that a species? Help us understand what those words mean so we can better understand testing and the different pathogens that exist in our body potentially.
So I'll help you best understand it as I know it. I could also be a little bit off on this, but the way it's been explained to me is that Borrelia burgdorferi sensu-lato, it's a group of species of Borrelia that causes Lyme disease. And it doesn't, so Borrelia burgdorferi sensu stricto is a Borrelia burgdorferi group that just includes Borrelia burgdorferi B31 and 297. And sensu-lato includes sensu stricto plus other species. So like Borrelia afzelii, Borrelia californiensis, Borrelia spielmanni. So all these Mayoni, all these other species that cause Lyme disease as well.
So in a nutshell, this Borrelia burgdorferi sensu latus testing, which is the Immunoblot test, is a high-level grouping of many, I'll call it micro-targeted species of, and I'm probably not using the right word with species, but micro, specific types of Lyme disease. So you're going to catch more because it's a higher level classification that looks at a wide variety of different types of Lyme disease, what you're saying, I believe, right?
So it's not different types of Lyme disease. Lyme disease is Lyme disease. That's just the name of the disease. But it's for some reason, the naming is not the best. Was it the nomenclature? So it's known as the Borrelia burgdorferi group. Yet you have a species called Borrelia burgdorferi B31 and then Borrelia burgdorferi 297. But within that Borrelia burgdorferi group, you also can have Borrelia afzelii. For example, that's a European species that can cause Lyme disease. So you could be bitten with a tick and you'll find out that's a specific species that tick was carrying. And so you have more of an idea of where it came from in the world.
Thank you. That actually cleared it up for me because I clearly didn't understand it. So thank you, Stuti, for
no
clearing it
worries.
up for me.
It's taken me a while to wrap my head around that as well. And I'm sure there are doctors and scientists who can better explain that.
So beyond, the Immunoblot and PCR and Western blot and things that we're very familiar with, you mentioned on your website, you do have things like this IGeneX spot and fish testing as well, which I think is different. So at a high level, can you just explain why do you do testing like that when the Immunoblot seems like it's the superstar, the rock star of testing? Why do you also offer these other types of tests beyond the Immunoblot?
So the Immunoblot is an antibody test. Some people are seronegative where they don't produce antibodies. And I believe that's around 20% of patients. So you want to offer a variety of testing so everybody has access. And the PCRs, again, are direct tests, but they're not always the most sensitive because you're not always getting you're not always going to capture the disease in the sample that you have. You don't know. So if you get a negative test, doesn't necessarily mean you're negative. But if you get a positive test, that's a little more certain because it's a direct test. Whereas fish testing is looking at the RNA, so the ribosomal DNA, and it's just a different type of direct test, but it's also really good, and we offer that for Babesia and Bartonella, and it's pretty popular. And it's on a genus level, so you're not looking at specific species, you're looking at Babesia as a whole or Bartonella as a whole. And then the other test, the IGeneX spot is the other one you mentioned. We offer that for Lyme and Bartonella, and it's similar to the Ellis spot. I don't know if you've heard of the Ellis spot. Is something that's been available as well. It's pretty similar to that, except this is one we've developed in-house, and that looks at your T cells. So those are the first cells that are, the first reaction that the body has when you're infected. And so it's good for really, really early detection, usually within the first week of being bitten, whereas immunoblots wouldn't quite cover that. You still have to wait for your antibodies to develop for an immunoblot to detect your antibody levels. Whereas with a T cell test, actually up to the first month, a T cell test would be pretty good. And then it's also very good for long-term, like chronic Lyme disease as well, or chronic Bartonella.
So that was really helpful. It's clear that there's no one, just like with treating Lyme disease, there's no magic cure or one pill treatment for Lyme disease. There's no one perfect test right now for Lyme disease. So that's why you have to offer so many, because the Immunoblot is an amazing test. But I never knew that 20% of people that are suffering from Lyme disease will never show an immune response on a test and therefore not test positive, is what you said, correct?
That's what I've heard. Around 20% of people don't produce antibodies. So they're known as seronegative.
And that's why you need a PCR test or a fish test, or so whether you're looking for the DNA or the RNA, other means to find the bacteria in our bodies to have a positive diagnosis for Lyme patients.
Correct.
So one of the things that you were talking about with Richard, I want to bounce back to also, is you kept referring to this antibiotic challenge that doctors will do. So can you give us a little more detail? Because we're always looking for ways to provide hacks or tips to people that are suffering from chronic Lyme. And many of us don't have a actual definitive test, only clinical. And, we've heard people tell us that they'll actually take antibiotics before they test. We've had people tell us that they're going to infrared sauna before they test because it'll help them activate the toxins and, bring everything out into their bloodstream, and all kinds of cool things to make themselves more likely to test positive and actually show an accurate result when they get their testing, because it is so expensive. So what do you mean when you say an antibiotic challenge that doctors will do with their patients when they do a test? What does that mean?
So an antibiotic challenge it's not something that we recommend or tell people to do, since again, we are a lab, so we can't, say, hey, you should go do an antibiotic challenge. We don't know what doctors specifically want the patients to do. However, some doctors do believe that if you, what's the word?
Provoke almost,
yeah,
right?
Provoke, yes. If you provoke the disease with some antibiotics, that it's going to drain out into the urine. And so that's where it's going to be expelled. And so if you test the urine, then you're more likely to detect the disease.
So I think I spent a lot of time geeking out on your website, and I know we talk about that. On one hand, it's overwhelming, but doctors like to get combinations. So you kind of want to strike that balance of what doctors want, but also making it not overly complicated. But what I really like about your new tick-borne disease test directory on your website is you can actually click into each specific test, right? So talk to us about why you felt that was important to share with people, where they can actually see every single test you offer and click into it and get specific details about every type of test, whether it's the PCR, the Immunoblot, the IGeneX spot, a fish testing, whatever it is, you can actually drill in and get that level of detail. What motivated you guys to put that on your website to educate the Lyme community so they can make a better informed decision when filling out that requisition form for their test?
So we get a lot of feedback through the conversations we have on the phone with our patients, with our doctors. And most of the time I cannot go through this test requisition form. It's too overwhelming. Like, can you help me? And so we understand that people process information in different ways. And especially in the Lyme community, you're already feeling like your head is foggy. Everything's a little slower at times. And especially when you're feeling really symptomatic, the last thing you want to do is be able to process all this information. And so the test directory just gives you a different way to go through it, and go through it a little slower maybe, and offer you different options on how to figure out what you need or what questions you want to ask, and how to show it to your doctor maybe, or a way for new doctors or even experienced doctors to go through our information. Just another variety, a different way. And it's actually been really useful for us as well in-house. So.
Yeah, I think something we've learned after interviewing almost 250 people is that when you arm yourself with information and knowledge, you're more likely to heal because you better understand it. So you're arming patients to learn in an easy manner so they can make themselves more likely to heal and overcome this disease. So that's why for me, it was so cool to see that you put this out there. And I don't remember seeing that when I looked at your website like last year, for example. So thank you for spending the time to put that together for us patients to be able to learn from your website.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
So, another cool part of your website that I really liked is your IGeneX Advantage. And you touch on this with Rich a little bit, with your IGeneX advantages. But what I really liked about what you talk about there is that you look for more and detect more no matter when you were exposed. And for me, that keyword when really stuck with me when I read that statement, right? Because so many of us are told we've been sick for years. I mean, we've heard this countless times. I've been sick for years. I finally tested positive for Lyme disease, but I was IgM positive, and my primary care doctor is telling me it's a recent infection and there's no way it's connected to my symptoms for the past several years. So what do you think about that, right? Because it's such a confusing topic when you finally get a diagnosis and you think you have Lyme, but now you're being told there's no way it can be a past infection. There's no way it's been in you for years because you're IgM positive only. What are your thoughts about that?
So one of the things to remember is you can get bitten more than once. And, it can happen at any time. It doesn't matter what your lifestyle is. It's more likely to happen if you're an outdoorsy person, but it's possible for anyone to get bitten. So when we say we detect at any time, whether you had a tick-borne disease, is referring to our variety of testing, because they're all looking at something different. And there's a graph as well. I believe it's on the website somewhere, that helps you see where where in the spectrum you might be. So, for example, T cell testing, the IGeneX spot looks at really early detection or really late stage detection. And so that's going to be more like an upside down bell curve where it's going to be detected early stage and late stage. And then you've got your immunoblots, antibody testing, which is really in the middle of the disease because you're looking at how your antibodies are reacting to infection. And IgM, for example, looks at recent acute exposure, and IgG looks at long-term chronic exposure or past exposure. But IgM can also be reactivated in the long term. So it's
Stuti,
important.
can you say that again? Because I want to make sure that I understand correctly. So IgM can, so is it
IgM
possible?
can be reactivated in the long
Okay.
term. So it's important to do both when you're testing.
But do you mean by that, Stuti, that I could have been bitten by a tick a year ago, been sick for a year, and tested positive for IgM because it was reactivated from a tick bite a year ago? Is that what you mean?
Either you've been rebitten or you just haven't converted yet.
Gotcha.
To IgG, and that's possible. That's, we see that is more technical than what I can answer, but it is something we come across all the time where people will say, oh, I think I should just do the IgG because I got bitten a year ago, or it's a past infection. And
but IgMs can last for quite a while, longer than one would think, basically. Okay.
Exactly.
So, but conversely, right? So people with active symptoms get tested by their doctors, and they test IgG positive and not IgM. And their doctors interpret that in some cases that IgG means a past infection, therefore it's no longer active. So how would you respond to that? Is that accurate?
No, I wouldn't say that's accurate, but again, the doctor would probably, I'm not medically qualified, so a doctor would know more than I do. Personally,
Maybe,
I don't think
not those doctors though, Stuti. I'm just going to jump in. I'll say not those doctors.
Okay. Personally, I feel like if your IgG is showing up really early on, maybe you've just converted quickly to IgG, or you've had it for a longer time than they think, or if you got bitten, maybe it's a reinfection. You've been bitten again.
But there could be
so many different possibilities.
But you can be IgG positive and still be sick. It doesn't mean that you're over the infection, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's what we've heard some doctors say, that if you have IgG, you're not sick anymore. You're over the infection, which is like mind blowing to hear that. So that's why that was the question. That makes us shake our heads when we hear that on this podcast. So it's a follow-up.
I can tell you right now, I have Bartonella, for example, but my IgG still shows up, but I'm still symptomatic even after treatment.
Exactly. So your IgG is still positive and you're still symptomatic because you're still sick from it. It doesn't mean that you're over it, essentially, correct?
Correct.
So you did talk about, Stuti, also that there are different stages of different tick-borne illnesses. And on your website, you break it down to early disease and late disease. And on the same tick-borne disease test directory, you then filter your testing based on whether you suspect you have an early disease or a late disease. So give us a little bit more detail. You kind of talked about it already, but what testing specifically is good for late disease versus early disease?
So early disease most likely would be your IGeneX spot. That's like within the first month. And then immunoblots are all the time. It's a good test to do at any stage. And PCRs, if your immunoblots, PCRs and immunoblots should be done in conjunction because you don't know whether you're seronegative or not. And trying to think, what was another test? Fish testing varies. That's because it's just for Babesia and Bartonella. And you're looking at the RNA. So again, that can be at any stage as well. But really, IGeneX spot is right at the beginning, and immunoblots the rest of the time.
So now, Stuti, I want you to brag a little bit, and I can tell already you're very humble and you don't want to brag. So I'm going to help you brag a little bit about this, because people that are listening and thinking, well, how good is IGeneX? What have they accomplished, right? You talk about on your website that you arm your scientists with the most cutting edge technology available. And when you hear that, it sounds like it's a marketing term, but then you give substance to that, right? And we've talked a little bit about this offline. We've had discussions with other people about this. You were the first to introduce a relapsing fever Western blot test. before anybody else in the world, right? You were the first to introduce comprehensive Lyme immunoblots and tick-borne relapsing fever immunoblot tests in the world, which is the most accurate testing in the world. So, again, nothing is better. We're using technology from 1994 when we do it through LabCorp request, right? So that just shows that you're focusing primarily on tick-borne diseases and therefore coming up with the best testing using the most current science, not antiquated decades old science, correct? So is there anything else you can add to that kind of give us some, some assurances about how accurate and good your lab is as far as being able to develop new tests and constantly improve for the community?
Correct. So thank you. But so what happens is we test exclusively for tick-borne diseases and COVID now as well, obviously, because we want to help the community. We want to help in the fight against COVID. We have the technology to be able to do so. So we have been. But our main focus is tick-borne diseases. That's what we specialize in. It started off just with Lyme. And it's always been important to us that it's in-house, that we're developing everything here. It's available to us so that we're able to help people easily. We're able to improve on what we have, and we're not just buying kits from other places and making a standardized operation here. It's very much, how do we improve on this test to better serve the Lyme community, to help our doctors diagnose and treat their patients better. And so we have a research and development team, and their main focus is this. This is what they do all day long, is working on how do we make our PCR better? What's a new test we can introduce that would just be, again, better for testing. So for lack of a better word.
But clearly, I mean, look, you're reacting and moving with society. So you're keeping up with tick-borne illness, and then COVID hits, and you react immediately. And now you're helping with the pandemic. I mean, you've been helping with the pandemic for quite some time, obviously. But I guess I want to quickly ask you a question about that, because you can get obviously rapid testing is not great for COVID, and obviously the PCR testing is still not perfect either. But what's different about your COVID testing compared to if I went to down the block, I went to the walk-in clinic and I got a rapid and a PCR test? How is yours better?
So we offer the PCR test, so the RT-PCR, which is available in other places as well. Our main competitive advantage is turnaround time. So we know that for COVID, it's really important you get results as quickly as you can. And we have a same-day program, so people can come in and do same-day testing, and also 24-hour testing. But we also service a lot of assisted living facilities, schools, sports teams, and just people to be able to get on with their daily lives. And the local community over here as well. We're in Milpitas, California, so we've been working with the fire department, and we help through there as well.
And there's clearly a huge overlap between the chronic Lyme community and now the COVID long haul community. We know many people that are dealing were dealing with chronic Lyme or were in remission from chronic Lyme, and then got COVID, and then either had Lyme reactivated or developed long COVID, or who knows which is really true, right? Was it reactivation of Lyme, or was it long COVID, or both? And I think we're still trying to understand what that means. But I think you're testing beyond, the quick turnaround for an active present infection recently with, right now with COVID. Can you also help people look to see if they have antibodies to COVID, or know if they've had COVID, to see if that plays a role in activating their Lyme disease and making it worse potentially?
Yeah, so we've basically taken our Immunoblot technology and developed COVID Immunoblots. So people can see if they've had, if their IgG is positive, if they've had past COVID infection, and they can do a PCR to see if they're cleared or not. And IgM sometimes can indicate it's still active, but it can also indicate that you have been exposed to COVID.
So a quick question that I think I missed a little bit earlier on is, when we hear about Western blots and we hear about the Immunoblot, we always hear about the word banned, right? So there's bans for IgG and there's bans for IgM. And we hear, we just watched a monster, the Monster Inside Me documentary, which is a movie that's going to be coming out in May. And they talk about how in the 90s, the CDC actually removed bans from the Western blot so less people would turn up positive because they couldn't deal with the crisis of chronic Lyme disease at the time. And it was really interesting to listen to and hear. But if you just first quickly, can you give us what is a band? On your website, you refer to it as a band-KDA, which is also known as a protein. So what does that mean? When you're looking for these IgG, which is a past infection generally, or an IgM, which is an active infection generally, what is a band and why do you look for them to be able to determine if they have an infection or not?
So KDA stands for like kilodalton. And basically bands are like protein bands. So they have different weights. And when you're looking at the bands, some are significant to Lyme disease, some aren't, but they're still included because you could have other bands, you could have other infections affecting you. So when we're looking at our immunoblots or even the Western blots, you're looking to see if you have 2 or more of these significant bands, because these bands indicate whether you've had exposure to Lyme or not. Whereas the CDC looks at 5 bands, we look at 2 significant bands. And we also cover a wider range of bands that are significant to Lyme.
So I think you answered my follow-up question, because I did notice looking at your website that the CDC actually looks for more IgG bands than your immunoblot test, which I'm like, wait a second, I thought your test was better. But your response to that is, well, we look for less bands for IgG because we're looking for more specific bands that mean these are Lyme disease bands, not the non-specific ones that the CDC is looking for as well. Is that what your answer was?
Correct. So the CDC, for example, they've got several bands there, but they require more of them to be positive to say that you've been exposed.
But on the flip side, your IgM testing has far more bands than the CDC. So why did you decide to go with that approach for IgM, but with IgG, you're looking for more specific, less bands in the CDC?
So it's specific. So our specific bands for IgM and IgG are pretty similar. It's just the CDC that has less. I'm not sure why they do, actually. I don't know.
Because they removed them probably.
I think they have a lot of other bands as well, but just which ones are specific for Lyme, what they consider. Yeah.
So I do want to, I know we're keeping you here, but I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you from the community. So we did a very quick Instagram poll. We got an overwhelming amount of questions for you. So I'm just gonna pick a couple of them and ask you a few questions from community members and just kind of cite them if you don't mind. And we kind of grouped them as well. One of the most common questions we got, so I'll just kind of read the first one. That this is from a apocalypse.meow, which is a very awesome Instagram handle. Got to say that. But she said that her MD refused to treat Lyme disease based on a positive IGeneX test because she had a negative CDC test. So she said, what tips do you have for discussing this with her doctor to get her doctor to realize that just because she was negative on a CDC regular LabCorp test doesn't mean that the positive IGeneX test is now null and void?
So if their doctor is pretty open-minded and willing to learn about our testing or speak to our lab manager or lab director, that would be great. And they could talk them through, what test was done, why it's positive, what instead of just dismissing it. We get a lot of patients who call in and say, oh, my doctor said you guys are quacks. Like we don't believe in, they don't believe in your testing. And it's usually because of the controversy surrounding Lyme disease testing and whether you believe in chronic Lyme or not, whether you're following old CDC guidelines. The Infectious Diseases Society of America, for example, really recommends following the CDC guidelines and is pretty anti-chronic Lyme. And so a lot of doctors will follow whatever is set by the Infectious Diseases Society of America.
So there was, a lot of people. So actually, one of our good friends, Ashley Marble, who we interviewed about a year and a half ago, she asked the same question: how do you get regular doctors to recognize IGeneX, which you answered? Then,
sorry,
go ahead.
I do have a follow-up to that. So a specific way to do that, instead of just speaking to our lab manager and lab director, is also to refer to the articles. And we have a lot of papers that have been written on our website. So under resources, again, there is material there that they can refer to, and they can, give it to their doctor. So it's under the Knowledge Center.
So I love that study because I think there are more open-minded doctors than we like to believe. And I happen to have one where with other things, I will bring him information that I'm learning and studying and absorbing. He'll learn with me and we grow together and we improve my health together. And he can improve his other patients because of how we're learning and growing together with tick-borne illness, which is so still controversial and a lot unknown there, right? So if patients educate themselves and go to your resources tab on your website and to your knowledge center, they can learn, share those resources, and help their doctors that aren't necessarily a believer because of learning what the IDSA says. This can help them have real hard science to back up your testing, to have faith in it, to give them a diagnosis.
That's correct. That's amazing for you as well. You're very lucky that you have a doctor that's so open-minded. I know a lot of people are not as lucky, but I think I agree with you. I think there are a lot of doctors out there who would be willing to look at this information and deduce for themselves whether they can help their patients or not. And if they don't believe what they're reading, then they can come back with why. But at least it's it's a better argument than no, we just don't believe in that.
Yeah, and I think one of the tips that I've learned to help doctors and just people in the community is when you reference .gov studies that are backed by the federal government or backed by major universities like Duke University or Tulane University, when you bring them those studies that have hard evidence-based scientific studies, it's very difficult to refute them because these studies are being done. They're just not publicly talked about as much as we'd like. So I think that's really an important tip, is to find these studies that are, National Institute of Health, NIH.gov studies, bring them to your doctors, bring studies from these major universities that are studying tick-borne illnesses, bring them to your doctors. And then if they're open-minded, they're going to, I think, hopefully read them and be able to work with you. And if not, there are many other doctors people can look for. But this question was also asked by Fatima Arujo 79, and you answered the question about what to do if a doctor won't recognize IGeneX as being a positive test. Same thing for Jose Ella, and I'm horrible with names. I'm sorry, Jose, but Jose Ella Livieri. And same question about that. And wanted to know if his doctor wanted to accept the CDC positive test, what can he do to help educate his doctor? And then the next question that came in though, Stuti, is if CDC and IGeneX are both negative, meaning the traditional LabCorp, Quest, et cetera, testing is negative, and IGeneX is negative after doing a pretty diverse, wide set of IGeneX testing, does that mean for sure that they don't have Lyme disease?
I wouldn't be able to answer that because Lyme isn't just diagnosed based off of testing. Testing is just one of the tools. It's also your symptoms. It's also your clinical history, and that's definitely where you go back to your doctor and see what to do next. But maybe it's not Lyme disease. Maybe it's another tick-borne illness.
So this is from @Earl Avery Michael. So I think your answer is possible you don't have Lyme, but it's also possible you do and the testing just didn't show it, or it's possible you have another tick-borne illness because not everything is Lyme disease, basically.
Correct. So a lot of patients as well, when they call in, one of the things that surprises them is you can have a different tick-borne illness and not have Lyme disease. It's called a co-infection, but it doesn't mean you have to have Lyme disease to have Babesia or Ehrlichia or Anaplasma.
And I still use the word co-infection, but every time I say it, I hate it because it's not. Yes. It implies you have to have Lyme to have these other things, and you don't have to have Lyme to have these other things, right? So I think that's something that we need to educate people about as well.
I agree.
So we have our Rich and I become very close with Debbie and Candice, who run Two Alpha Gals, an amazing group about alpha gal syndrome from the Lone Star Tick. They want to know, do you have any alpha gal testing? And if not, do you plan on developing alpha gal tests at any point in the future?
So I'm ashamed to say I've never heard of it. And it's not something that I see us having in the works yet. I hope so one day, but
I think it's much less prevalent probably in California where you are. Here on Long Island, especially in the Northeast, it's an allergy to red meat and a lot of other things as well, like a lot of types of food and things like that and you get it from a Lone Star tick. But that was something I think is becoming more and more known. And we've made observations that people that have a lot of food sensitivities that don't get better with Lyme disease, when they get tested for alpha gal, they're finding out they're positive, especially here in the Northeast. So it's something that I think is another one of those things where you're sick, you're not getting better, but you're treating Lyme. Well, are you testing for alpha-gal? Because you could have that as well. You could have been bitten by a deer tick and a Lone Star tick because there's so many ticks around here, right? So it's something that I think a lot of people are starting to think about more and more, especially in the Northeast. And again, and everywhere, I think it's just less prevalent probably in California.
How do you pronounce that again?
It's alpha-gal, ALPHA-GAL syndrome, alpha-gal syndrome.
Alpha-gal.
Yeah.
So it's also like mycoplasma. A lot of people ask us if we test for mycoplasma. We don't, but hopefully one day we will.
So another one is from Nadia by Nature. She wants to know which test should she get if she's had treatment from Lyme disease, never got better, she's been sick for quite a long time, and wants to see if the infection's been cleared. Meaning, do you even have a test like that, right? I think the infection is cleared because I'm feeling better, but how do I know that I'm actually maybe in remission, or maybe the infection is not active in my body?
So your antibody testing would show you whether your body is still fighting the infection. It would be something you'd have to discuss with your doctor, though, to see what they recommend. But we do know that antibody testing shows whether it's still acute, it's still reactivated, or if it's long-term chronic exposure, it's past, or if it's just not there anymore.
So if you do the traditional Western blot or the superior immunoblot and you test positive, that means you are still having an infection and therefore it's not passed, basically.
Not necessarily. So again, your symptoms come into play and your clinical history again. So it depends on all those factors.
So it's
just so difficult to say what each person should do because it's so individualized. It's so specific for each person depending on what else they have going on, what else is going on with their bodies. So it's hard to say, and that's why it's always something that a doctor would need to help with.
And we appreciate your honesty because we do know nothing about chronic Lyme disease is simple. And of course, testing is not simple for Lyme disease, right? So there is no cut and dry answer, unfortunately, to a lot of these things. But I think the more information you provide us, the more we can arm ourselves with this knowledge and education, the better we can make educated decisions in our trial and error process to try to identify what's going on and feel better, which is what it's all about. We just want to feel better, right? I mean, so
exactly. You just want to improve your quality of life. You've been hit with something, this tiny little nuisance that you didn't expect to just upend everything, cause you all this financial, physical, and emotional distress. I mean, like
my final question before Rich picks back up that I want to ask you from our friend Krista. She wants to know, parasites are becoming a more and more popular discussion in the Lyme community as well. And we do know that obviously Babesia is a bloodborne parasite. We do know that you can get things like nematodes in your brain. We learned from Dr. Alan McDonald, which then kind of work hand in hand with Lyme to create brain inflammation and even cellular death and tissue death in your brain. But there are also intestinal parasites people develop and have many times with Lyme disease as well. So there's many different types of parasites. Do you offer any specific parasite testing beyond Babesia at IGeneX?
No, just Babesia.
And with the Babesia testing, it's, I think, important to note that although it's a bloodborne parasite, it's not, if people have Babesia and they don't know it and they're getting Lyme treatment, they're not going to get better, right? Because the treatment for Lyme disease is not going to work for Babesia, like possibly, anaplasma is going to work with some of the same treatment as Lyme disease as well, correct?
So that's what I've heard. I don't know for sure, but I have heard, and it's something I've read as well, that Babesia is so tricky. Even Bartonella, they're really tricky to treat. And you have to really go for those first and treat them first before you can tackle Lyme disease. And if you're treating for Lyme disease, I believe that you do end up treating Ehrlichia as well. I don't quote me on that. Again, that would be the doctor. Treatment, diagnosis, that's all the doctor's job. So yeah, testing, that would be us.
So Stuti, you've been really generous with your time, and there are a couple of little areas I'd like to explore with you before we let you go. Sure. And the first is, what is the future for IGeneX? Meaning, what kinds of testing are you focusing on? What kind of refinements are you focusing on? And what areas do you think you'll be testing in the future?
So our goal is always to bring the latest and greatest to everyone out there. And I believe we are trying to develop our immunoblots for other diseases, and also improve upon testing that we do currently have, especially because we want to be able to match our indirect and direct testing to be just as effective as each other and not one to totally outweigh the other. So that way you're getting the best of the best when you do both types of tests.
So the last question I want to ask you is, what kind of patterns are you folks observing at IGeneX? Meaning, what are the changes that you're seeing from the blood tests and the urine tests and the other fluid tests that you're doing with regard to the number of co-infections, the number of people who are suffering from diseases, and are you seeing regional differences? And maybe you can take each of those three questions separately.
So in terms of patterns that we're seeing, it's difficult to tell right now because the past 2 years have been so COVID centric. A lot of people haven't been going to their doctor's offices, so there's been a lot of suffering in silence. So the pattern wise, that's difficult to say right now. It'll be more telling in the next few years. As far as I'm sorry, what was your
The second question is, are you seeing any additional co-infection, for example, like in the past where you're seeing tests where people were largely just testing for Lyme, and are you seeing a larger number of, I know the term you, Matt, and I all hate this, co-infection, but are you seeing a greater number of tests for these other pathogens other than Lyme?
For example, in 2018, we saw more people who tested with us were positive for Babesia than for Lyme disease. So that's, that was pretty eye-opening for us. It just shows you that it might not be Lyme disease that's the most widespread disease out there. It could be tick-borne relapsing fever. I mean, I think that that's everywhere. And so that's another one that I had in Lyme disease, but I've treated. So it's very common to not just have one disease, to have more than one. Two is very common, and then as you get more, it gets less common.
And the last question I was asking you is about region. Are you seeing people from certain regions of the country suffering from different types of diseases, or are you seeing the same general sort of breakdown of disease nationally?
So that's tricky because that depends on what people are testing for from different parts of the country and the world, and what they believe is in their area. We're definitely seeing a spike from the Midwest, for example. A lot more diseases are coming back positive in those areas. And, it's not an area people used to think carries tick-borne diseases, but now that's a growing tick-borne disease area. And North Carolina, Pennsylvania, California is a huge hotbed. And up north in Canada, British Columbia and Vancouver Island, there are ticks all over Vancouver Island. And you'll have people saying, oh, but there's no such thing as tick-borne diseases in Canada. And so it just depends on where you are, honestly, and whether you think there's tick-borne diseases in your area or not.
So do you think it's the changes that you're seeing are really more a function of awareness generally from the patient community and awareness from the medical community, or do you believe that the trends are developing more ticks and therefore more contact with ticks in other parts of this country and I guess Canada?
I think it's awareness is a huge thing. So if you're aware of what ticks carry and that it could be in your region, and that, just because you live somewhere, you're not gonna, you got bitten by a tick, but nothing's gonna happen to you because you're safe in your area. That's a huge part of it. And also, it's not just awareness, it's also what messaging your health department puts out there. So, your health department different states health departments play a big role in and what they're looking for, what they expect. So we have to report positive cases to the health departments all over the country. And certain states' health departments ask for only specific diseases. For example, Bartonella, I think only a couple of states will ask for positive cases of Bartonella, but that's all over the US. And Lyme disease, it'll be like, no, we only want the antibody testing. We don't want to know about the PCR. And it's like, but that counts.
Interesting. So, Stuti, we can't thank you enough for taking time out of your really busy schedule to introduce your wonderful lab to the Tick Bootcamp community. And we can't thank you enough for the great work. So please extend our appreciation to Dr. Shah and all the good folks at IGeneX for all the great work you're doing in the Lyme disease community.
I will do. And thank you so much for having me and everything you guys are doing. Honestly, just you are doing the awareness part of this, about bringing awareness to the community. And that for me, that's one of the most important parts, because without that, people don't know.
Thank you for listening to our Tick Bootcamp interview with our guest, Stuti Vora. To our listeners, we have a call to action. First, if you'd like to learn more about Stuti, please visit her on Instagram at IGeneX Lab. Second, if you've enjoyed this episode of our Tick Bootcamp podcast, please share it with your friends on social media. Third, Tick Bootcamp has created a Tick Bite Blueprint that has been inspired by the information that has been shared with us by past podcast guests. We urge you to visit our website at tickbootcamp.com to view our blueprint. Please note, we appreciate any input or improvements you'd like to share with us. Fourth, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify to get your automatic episode updates of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. And finally, we thank you, our community, for your comments on our past podcast episodes. Please take a minute to leave us an honest review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, on social media, or on our website. We make it a point to read every single one of the reviews you share with us. Thank you, as always, for listening.